Hi. So let's continue our discussion with domain enumeration. We are going to extract some information from group policy and see if that is useful for any abuse later on. So what is group policy? Group policy provides the ability to manage configuration and changes easily and centrally in AD. Domain administrators can make many changes or configuration settings across organizational units for users and users objects, computers, and other objects to control them easily and once again centrally. So what group policy allows us is the configuration of security settings like, for example, password policies, registry-based policy settings. So many of them can be applied using group policy. Then there are startup or shutdown and log on or log off scripts, which are also heavily abused. And then we can also control software installation, restricting a installation or forcing an installation using group policy can be done. This also means that uh, if we have access to group policy settings, or if we have escalated our privileges already, group policy can be abused to centrally push interesting uh, attacks or centrally push backdoors, etc., on all the machines in an OU or all the machines in a domain. So this, which makes group policy very interesting for an attacker as well. We can either use PowerView or the group policy module to extract information from group policy. Please keep in mind that I have not tested the group policy module the same way I did for the Active Directory rule. I'm not sure if we can use the group policy module, the Microsoft signed group policy module, without admin privileges or without installing RSAT. A couple of commandlets for the group policy module are here just for the reference. But using PowerView, we can actually get some interesting information from the group policy. Please keep in mind that this has been a well-known abuse for so many years. So we are not going to spend a lot of time on group policy. So if I run getnet GPO, I get, this is a PowerView function. I will get a list of all the group policy objects in the domain, right? Let's run it with a filter on display name. So we have 5 group policy objects here. These two, the default domain policy and the default domain controllers policy. These two are the default ones in every domain. We have 3 additional group policies: students, app locker, and servers. Now, if we would like to check if which of these policies is applied on a particular machine, let's try it for our own machine. Our machine is called student admin, std admin dot dollar corp dot money corp dot local. Okay, there's a typo here. It's dollar corp. So the machine is dcorp std admin. Yeah. So I run dcorp std admin here, and we can see that the group policy called students is applied on this particular machine, on our current machine, right? As far as I know, there is no function in PowerView which shows resultant set of group policy on our current machine. That we can always get using gp results. Gp result, that's gp result slash r. If I run that, now we get the resultant set of policy here. So our current user is a part of the following security groups. Do we have anything special here for this particular machine? Doesn't look like that. If I specify a v as well, and then we'll get a verbose policy. nothing special seems to be applied on this particular machine, right? So we can get that using GP result, the resultant set of policy applying on our machine. Uh, Now, if we would like to check restricted groups which are applied using group policy, so it is always possible to do something like this. For example, we saw that the students group policy is applied on our machine. We can always do something like this. In some environments there could be a setting in our domain, in the default configuration, in the stock configuration, in our safe state, we are not using any restricted group, but we can always have something like this. Many environments use this, where we actually have some restricted groups, right? Those restricted groups could be a part of a local group or something like that. If the restricted group setting is populated over here, or the configuration is set, we can actually run getnet GPO group to have a look at that. So that group is, so right now we will not see any output here, which is expected because we are not using any restricted group in the domain. But if you run this, you will get a list of the restricted groups. So once again, restricted groups are those groups which are pushed through the group policy and are part of a local group on your machine. If you remember the infamous bug in domain controllers or in Windows domains, which came out a few years back, where we can extract passwords of users which were local administrators, which were created using group policy. This thing is helpful in an attack similar to that. Not, we do not get user passwords here, but we do get a target group which is part of all the groups. So if we can compromise any user which is a part of that group, and that group is a restricted group which is pushed on multiple machines in an organizational unit, we will have a nice access across all those machines. So this is what restricted groups are. Now, not only that, not only groups, we can also actually get users which are in a local group of a machine using GPO. So let's say a user is pushed or made part of a local group. Let's say you uh, create a user which is made part of, let's say, RDP users group on remote desktop users group on all the machines using group policy. Then we can actually enumerate that using find GPU computer admin. Uh, we can also do it the other way around. We can look for machines where a particular user is member of a specific group. Please keep in mind that this would also be visible only if there is a user who is member of a specific group using group policy. We do not use any of these settings in the domain deliberately. So there is no point trying to run these uh, commands, but these could be useful in a real world Active Directory setting. Now, as we discussed in the beginning of this video, that group policies are applied on OUs or organizational units. So we can get a list of OUs using getnet OU. So let's run getnet OU. So that is a list of organizational units in our domain. If I run it with full data, we'll get some additional information about each and every one of these OU. Now, if we want to retrieve which GPO is applied or which group policy object is applied on a particular OU, we can read GPU name from the GP-link attribute and then run getnet GPU. So for example, if we would like to see which OU is applied on, let's say, the student machines OU. So student machines is an organizational unit, and we would like to see which group policy is applied on it. It is this group policy which is applied on this particular machine. Let's run this with getnet GPU name and Let's run it like this. So it is the students group policy which is applied on the student machines OU. Right, so just some basic information which we could extract from the group policy using Power View. Uh, and that would be all actually which we would do with the group policy right now in the domain enumeration phase. So some quick learning objectives. You need to list all the OUs from the our current domain, which is $corp. List all the computers in the student machines OU. This is a bit tricky, not much tricky. You just need to use some filters. List the GPUs and then enumerate GPU applied on the student machines OU. Nothing very hard to do. This should be a quick one. Now, continuing our discussion in the, I'm not going to dedicate another video for that. So we will have more videos for domain enumeration. So for the continuing our discussion, we will discuss ACLs. So how does access control work in a domain environment? There are two parts of any access in a domain. One is the access token and another one is security descriptor. So whenever a process wants to access any object in the domain, it presents its access token to that object. What does that access token have? It has the identity of the principal and privileges, or identity of the user and privileges of the user. And the object which the process is trying to access would have security descriptors. What security descriptors? It would have SID or security identifier of the owner of the object, DACL or discretionary ACL. Discretionary ACL is the list of permissions, that is, who have the permissions to access an object, and SACL or system ACL, which controls the audit policy on that object, that is, logging of success or failure of a particular write. So that is how access control model works in Active Directory. So this is how it looks like. Every object has a security descriptor, which would have owner, SACL, and DACL. So that there would be an owner, SACL, and DACL. And DACL and SACL both are made up of ACs or control entries. Each individual entry is called an entry, and a list of entries is called a list. That is, for example, an ACL, right? This is quite similar. Access token and security descriptor is quite similar to what we have commonly in offices, let's say for access control. You will have generally, this is how access control works in offices. You will have your ID, which you punch in while you go into the office. With that ID contains your identity and your privileges. For example, you may have access to your own room or cubicle or your own development center, but not the office of the CEO, right? So what your card has is your identity and your privileges according to you, and what and where you punch it, whether it's an NFC or a NFC communication or a touch communication or whatever it is. What the access control have is what are the permissions your identity have. That is, you present your identity and privileges, and then the target object checks the privileges you claim to have against a list of permission it has for each and every object. That list of permissions is called DACL. It may be a bit more clear if we have a look at it in the domain scenario, right? For example, let's have a look at the uh, entries or DACL for, let's say, for the domain admins group, right? So this is what a DACL looks like. It has the SID of the owner. So domain admins is the owner. The SID is also present in this DACL. Each of this entry is an ACE. What is an ACE? We'll come back to that in a moment. that diagram or that list in a moment. So each ACL comprises of a list of ACEs or access control entries. ACE corresponds to individual permission or audit access. That is, who has permission and what can be done in an object. That is what an individual permission is. Now, each ACE or each ACL, as we saw, comprises of two types, DACLs and SACLs. So this particular thing is an ACE. For example, what this ACE tells us, this ACE is an allow type. That is, it allows administrators principal, that is the administrators group of D Corp, some privileges on the current object, which is domain admins, right? And this is how we can add ACEs. Let's say we would like to add for student one. For student one, let's say we want to provide it full control over the domain admins group, right? Similar, the same like the system has. So this would be an ACE, and all of these combined together is an ACL. And this is what the SACL or the SACL looks like. This is the audit control. That is, what does this ACE means? That whenever anyone uses some special access on the domain admins object, there would be a log, but only for the success, not for the failure, right? So this is what a SACL looks like. Now, so this should be quite clear now. What a DACL is, what an ACE is, how ACEs make ACL, what are the types of ACL, DACL, and SACL. Now, both of them are very important for attackers. DACLs look more cool and useful, which they are, but never ignore SACLs as well, because it is the SACL which logs any changes you made to any object, uh, regardless of your privileges. So how do we enumerate ACLs? We can get the ACLs associated with a specific object using get object ACL from Power View. And we can recall that whatever enumeration we have been doing, we are doing it without any special privileges onto the domain level, right? So let's run get object ACL and get a list of interesting ACEs or ACL for the student one. Now this is how we read an ACE, right? There are three most important properties of an ACE, although all of these are important. But to understand an ACE, you can begin with these three properties. Object DN, that is object distinguished name, that is student one. So that is a target object. This ACE is for student one. Then identity reference is which user has permissions. So built-in administrators. So what this ACE tells us, that on student one, built-in administrators have certain permissions or rights. What rights? That is listed in the Active Directory rights. So this is quite equivalent to full control. You can write property, delete, write DACL, write owner, whatsoever. So this means that on student one, built-in administrators have very high or very interesting privileges, which makes sense, right? Built-in administrators is the all-powerful group. Now, some other interesting options here is this permission inherited or implemented directly? It is inherited. Uh, and this is an allow entry. It is not a deny entry. Uh, it is container inherit, that is, it is implemented on the student machines OU, and from there it has been inherited on this particular student. And this is the SID of our student one user, right? So this is how we read an ACE, right? The target user, that is, we are reading it for student one, where built-in administrators have these privileges. This is how we read ACEs. How is this helpful? For example, later on, let's say if you would like to filter on which objects built-in administrators have any rights or an interesting right. So you can always run get object ACL or retrieve ACLs for all the machines in the domain, and then filter it for identity reference built-in administrators, right? Now we can also get ACLs associated with a specified prefix. So we can use SAM account name or we can use ADS prefix. It is also possible to enumerate ACLs using the Active Directory module, but without resolving GUID. So if you have a look at the source code of PowerView, PowerView painstakingly creates a table of GUIDs or GUIDs or extended GUID rights, uh, so that you can use anything like resolve GUIDs. If we run get object ACL or any ACL related commandlet without resolve GUIDs, it would be much faster because PowerView would not need to create a table for the GUID rights. So we can get, just in case you are stuck into the PowerShell module or you're liking it because of its capabilities or advantages, you can use this, but it will not resolve the extended GUID rights. So we have the AD module here. If I run this, what we are doing here, we are listing the ACL for the administrator user. And this is what the ACL looks like. So what we can see here, let's run it for the same, or let's read it this way nonetheless. Okay, this is an interesting entry. Here what we can see that on administrator, MCorp enterprise admins, that is enterprise admins or forest, have some interesting rights. What rights? Close to full control, right? We can write owner, write decals, etc. That is for the administrator user, which makes sense, right? So this way we can also read ACLs with the help of the Active Directory module. We can also use the same get object ACL. We can also use the option of ADS path to look for ACLs associated with a specified LDAP path. Another very interesting uh, tool is or function is invoke ACL scanner. What invoke ACL scanner does, it looks for interesting ACs. What are interesting ACs? Interesting ACs are those ones, are those according to invoke ACL scanner where we have write or modify any interesting write other than the read ones. So if I run invoke ACL scanner with resolve GUIDs, which may take a bit longer than expected, it will tell us about all the interesting ACLs according to it in the domain, which makes it very handy because ACLs are still some of the ignored parts of domain attack lifecycle, right? Not every organization implements ACL auditing regularly. So here what we can see that, for example, if we, let me stop this. Here what we can see that, for example, for this particular user, and this is how we learned to read ACEs on support 20 user, a group called RDP users have generic all, that is full control rights, and that is true for so many users. So this would be handy later on when we discuss ACL abuse, right? Similarly, we can get ACLs associated with a UNC path using get path ACL from the same script, right? So this was domain enumeration for ACLs, right? So some quick learning objectives. We need to enumerate following for the $COP domain. Quite easy ones: ACL for the users group, ACL for the domain admins group, and all modify rights or modify permissions, that is interesting ACLs for the student X. Student X means for your own student ID. If you're student 3, then look for student 3. If you're student 10, look for student 10, and so on, right? So that would be all for this video. Thank you very much for watching.